Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graben. Our guest today is Rupal Patel. She's, get this, a former CIA analyst turned serial entrepreneur. She's embarked on what's certainly an unconventional journey from being in military briefing rooms in jungles to being in corporate boardrooms and international stages. Her newly released book is titled From CIA to CEO: Unconventional Life Lessons for Thinking Bigger, Leading Better, and Being Bolder. She served primarily under President George W. Bush after 9/11. She became an intelligence expert on Afghanistan and actually being in Afghanistan. She advised four-star generals, earned war zone service medals, and was recognized by the CIA director for, quote, superior support to the President of the United States. So after leaving the CIA, Rupal earned her MBA and started her first award-winning business over 10 years ago. She's now also a sought-after international speaker and corporate advisor who's spoken in front of thousands and has delivered programs for Fortune 500 companies around the world and the White House. So Rupal, thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
It's really lovely to be here with you, Mark, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear about your book and just a very fascinating career that you've had. You're born in Staten Island, but joining us from the UK. That's correct.
You got it. Exactly. Yeah.
So that kind of homecoming back to the White House after working there and coming back to the U.S. to, I'm sure it's always a special opportunity. I've never been inside the White House. I can only
You have to
imagine.
go through different entrances now, or I had to go through a different entrance now, but the inside has stayed the same. So, yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and ask the key question we always start off with. I'm curious what aspect of your career the story will be from. But
Yeah.
Rupal, what's your favorite mistake?
Oof. This is a really painful one, and one that I wish I could say I've never sort of fallen foul of again. But for me, it's dates from my time at the agency. And basically, it's about not standing up for myself. So in this specific context, it's actually, well, I'll give into as many of the details as I possibly can. But basically, I had a supervisor who accused me of having an inappropriate relationship with another supervisor. And he was very not subtle about it. And it totally floored me because I mean, there was no way in any universe that anything like this could have even been contrived out of anything. And I just didn't see it coming. And the supervisor who had made this accusation, sort of had a bit of a reputation for being very emotional, very erratic, very irrational. But even still, like he and I were on good terms. So when this happened, I didn't know what to do. And so what I did do is I was really confused at the time, and I just sort of let him say these things, and then I left his office, and then I went home later that day and sobbed my eyes out and was like, what the hell just happened, and how did this happen? And then again, that horrible thing that, and I wonder if maybe women do this more than men, what did I do to deserve this, right? Like, did I somehow bring this on myself? And then I had a conversation with my partner at the time, and he was like, no, that's on him. You're being an idiot. There's nothing there. Like, you need to go back and either file a complaint against him officially, or at the very least, stand up for yourself. And so the next day, I did. And I just confronted him, and I just said, look, I'm not the only person who has that close of a relationship with this other supervisor. And, based on everything that you know about me and everything in general, like, this is a ridiculous thing to have said. And he started crying in the office when I confronted him about it. And then it turned into this really almost theatrical display of like, I am so sorry, and I don't know why I said that. And I think he had probably overnight reflected on the fact that, there's a potential lawsuit here. So what the hell is going, like, he needs to, sort of own up to his side. Anyway, it was a surreal experience on so many fronts. First, I, like many people, probably everybody, don't like being accused of things that you've not done, right? Like, it just was so, but it felt really personal. It was like somehow it was my fault, right? That was my initial reaction. And then afterwards, when I had time to process and move away from the context, realizing that no, he's the asshole here, and I'm not.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then confronting him. So I think the two things, the big takeaways that I took away from this experience was, one is, so often we blame ourselves for things that are not our fault. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever it's hard, and it's hard to know when that is the case, right? But to at least allow for the possibility that when things go wrong, or when things get ugly, or when someone misinterprets what you've done or said or whatever, it might have nothing at all to do with you. That was one sort of life lesson. But then secondly, and this is perhaps a more universal, like not just work context lesson as well, is it's never too late to fight back. And I think for me, I always get really hard on myself, where like I didn't stand up for myself in the moment, and I didn't give, somebody was snide to me or horrible to me, and I didn't come up with that brilliant comeback in the moment. And it reminds me of this wonderful, I'm a Seinfeld lover, of this wonderful Seinfeld episode where George is going on and on about, like the fact that he didn't come up with the best comeback in the moment, right? And I think we've all been in that place where it's like, why did I think of the most perfect thing to say after I left the room, or after that dinner, or whatever? That's how it happens for all of us. And sometimes it is too late, right? Sometimes that ship has sailed. You'll never see that person again, or you're never going to be in a position to confront them again, or whatever happens. But a lot of the times the fight doesn't stop until we decide it stops. And I think that for me has been a really valuable lesson, is that we're not always going to be able to respond in the moment, right? And yes, fine, you won't always get a second chance, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not, more often than we assume, I think we do have the opportunity to go back and fight our corner, and to push back against something that was wrong. And this is true about everything, right? Not just personal situations or personal contexts, but also things that are happening in the world around us. So I think, from that really ugly experience, and like I said, I don't think I've mastered it to the point where I'm like always standing up for myself and always being brave and always confronting. But it just reminded me that, like, one, again, it's not always me. It sometimes has nothing to do with me. And secondly, you can always go back a second time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I appreciate the lesson of, not beating yourself up, not blaming yourself for your reaction, or it being a challenge to react in the moment. I think of, times in my career, I've made mistakes where I was probably too quick to react. And I've had to learn sometimes, like sometimes taking a breath, or, putting into my arsenal, a phrase like, I think I need some time to think about this. Maybe can we pick this conversation up again later, instead of reacting in a way where then I get accused of being emotional, instead of, it being focused on, well, what was the issue at hand? George Costanza, was this where he came up with way too late? Well, the jerk store called.
Yes, the jerk store one.
And they're out of you. And then, like, he was trying to force it into a later conversation somehow.
That is brilliant. Thank you so much for remembering that. That's exactly the episode. Thank you.
At first, I thought you were going to go with, I'm a fan of like early seasons of The Simpsons, especially. There was an episode where Homer's friends, they're sitting around playing cards or something, and they say, "Yeah, Homer, you're kind of slow." And then you see it cuts to him, like he goes, "Hey, I'm not slow," and like everyone has already left.
I've been that person too. Me and Homer have a lot in common.
Yeah. So, I mean, thinking back to, think of leadership traits. Describing someone as being, having a reputation as being erratic or emotional, maybe not the best leadership traits, or maybe especially not in the CIA, or just, I guess it takes all kinds to do work like that.
Well, it does take all kinds. And the beauty of the agency, and I think probably most workplaces, is that it is, there are skews, but it does genuinely and generally reflect the full spectrum of humanity and of Americans, right? So you get everything, all of the extremes and everything in between. And again, there might be sort of overrepresentation of some personality types and traits and stuff, but relatively, sort of from a high level, it's pretty representative of the population. And I think this whole idea around emotions and leadership is really interesting, because there's so much I think there's a lot of gendering that happens around the emotions that are appropriate in the workplace and that are inappropriate in a workplace, you know? And so, for example, somehow anger and, I mean, not like overly aggressive behavior, but shouting and anger and that kind of stuff is, if not acceptable, it is at least not penalized in a workplace in the same way, and reputationally penalized. Maybe fine, from an HR perspective it might be, but reputationally, whereas, you know, things like crying at work or bringing sort of the more stereotypically feminine emotions to work is somehow seen as you having a weakness, right? And I think I find that really interesting, because people always, oh, you're being so emotional, and again, usually that's thrown at women as an accusation, right? When you're showing sadness or some sort of like down emotion. But, you know, men are being just as emotional when they're shouting and screaming and being aggressive and in your face, right? And so I think, and the way I think this it applies to leadership overall is that, again, it takes all sorts, for sure, and all of the extremes, both anger and sort of, you know, crying or whatever, you know, have come with repercussions. So if that's your style, then at the very least be grown up enough to acknowledge what the potential fallout of that is. But also, more important, I think it's about just being more self-aware of your emotional instincts, and then doing the work to try to manage the ones that are less helpful, less productive, not even less relevant, but just not helping the situation, right? If everybody's really anxious or nervous and there's a lot of chaos and churn, as there often is, for example, in a place like the CIA, then you don't want to be the other person running around like a headless chicken, right? You want to, as a leader, you want to be able to reflect on what's happening and shift how you behave and how you show up to what the context requires. And so I think all emotions can be used in a very, and I don't mean in a manipulative way, but can be used as an asset, right? Sometimes you need to show anger, you need to sort of show frustration or whatever. Sometimes you need to show a bit of vulnerability and a bit of humility, and all of these things. So I think there's no one emotion should have pride of place or you know, be in like the never show this at work. I mean, maybe there are some, but the reality is also just developing that self-awareness and that emotional intelligence to understand what the context requires. And I think that is something that comes more naturally to some than others, but is something that can, of course, be worked on. And I think most skills, especially the intangible leadership skills, are things that people can work on as much as they can work on the tangible ones.
Yeah. And maybe final question, you know, kind of wrap up your story, you know, that supervisor who made the accusation, and you had the follow-up discussion. And I mean, what happened going forward in that working relationship? Was that somebody you didn't really even work with that much? Because
no, he was my direct supervisor. And
right. But he was talking about making the accusation about you and a different supervisor.
Correct. Exactly.
That's my mistake. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So basically, I had effectively it was like the first among equals, right? I had two direct supervisors, but the one who made the accusation about the other one was the more direct one. Like he had sort of, had more of a day-to-day role in my work. And so what happened after that interaction was it totally ruined our relationship. I mean, you know, I think we both did a good job of being professional and you know, and not letting it be obvious that relationship was ruined. But from my perspective, I had no respect left for him. I would not have gone above and beyond for anything. I mean, I would do that for my team, and because that's what the mission required. But, you know, some of that, like that loyalty, or all of the loyalty and any respect I had for him was totally gone. And then thankfully for me, soon after that interaction, I deployed and I did a long-term sort of deployment somewhere else. And by the time I came back, he was no longer, you know, working in that role. But yeah, it ruined everything unnecessarily. It was from his perspective, from his side, it was one of the stupidest things he could have done.
Yeah. So I was going to ask if that had led to your departure from the agency, but it sounds like no, it was not an immediate.
Okay, I stayed many years after that.
Okay, well, good. Yeah. And thank you for serving our country and helping out around the world. So I did want to ask, though, about, you know, I'd love to hear a little bit, not just what you learned at the CIA, but a little bit of your thought process of joining the agency? It sounded like it was a couple of years after the 9/11 attacks.
It was, yeah.
There was a lot going on with Afghanistan, of course,
Yep.
at that time. What was your story for getting into that?
So they recruited me. I was in graduate school and I was getting a master's in international relations, and had I wouldn't say I decided anything, but I assumed that the next step for me would either be law school or the State Department. The CIA wasn't even on my radar. I had no idea that the agency even had roles for people like me who weren't necessarily going to be out there sort of, breaking into, denied areas and collecting secrets and converting assets and all of that kind of stuff. So I, like probably the vast majority of human beings, had a very myopic perception of what the CIA did. And so, yeah, it was not something that I even thought was a career option for me. And then when I was in grad school, I got sort of a tap on the shoulder, as it was, and was invited to apply. And so had a conversation with this gentleman about what that would entail, what it would look like. And he's like, let's have a longer chat. So we made time to connect properly. And then he sort of went through what that role would look like. And it seemed like a perfect fit for so many reasons, because I was studying international affairs, so clearly I was interested in that topic. For me, doing something that has some purpose and some bigger mission has always been important to me. And then, some of the, getting to live and work overseas, getting paid basically to be really smart about things that I'm already interested in, learning languages, all of that kind of stuff. It just seemed like a perfect fit. And so that's how it happened. It was not the plan, but it ended up being, an invitation that I wasn't going to say no to, or that I didn't know necessarily when I said yes to that conversation what I would be getting into, but the more I learned, the more perfect it seemed. And yeah, it was one of the best decisions I ever made.
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea was not to be sitting behind a desk in Langley the whole time.
No, definitely not. Well, that's what I was paid to do, right? That's what they hired me to do, was to be an analyst. And technically, if I wanted to stay at headquarters behind a desk all the time, I could have. But for me, even in graduate school, I never went into academia because I love theory, I love ideas, I love all of that stuff, but I wanted to also see it in practice. And so I figured, great that I'm here doing all this wonderful analytical work, but I also want to see how it impacts things that are actually happening in real time in the places that we really care about and the people who are using this information. And so I found as many ways as I possibly could to volunteer for or to create new opportunities to serve overseas.
And so, it sounds like it certainly wasn't a mistake joining the agency, but then, we talk about the lessons and things that you learned there. You decided to leave and go to business school. Was that a difficult decision, or did it seem like it was time for new challenges?
You've basically answered it exactly. So for me, it felt like I had done so many really interesting, rewarding, exciting, crazy, all of the bucket list that I had put together in my head for what I wanted to do during my career there, I had pretty much done. And the reason I left was exactly that. It was cool, I've done this and I've loved it and it's been great. And I can see myself staying here forever and making a career out of it. But I kind of was ready for a new challenge, and I didn't want to feel like I was getting complacent. And so I figured if I left, I could go and explore what else the rest of the world has to offer and see what else it's like on the outside. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, then I can, potentially go back. And, there are many agency officers who I had known who had left for a few years and then come back. And so it seemed like a relatively low risk proposition to just, to go out and see, like I said, sort of what the next challenge was going to be. And I have never sort of looked back since, but it was, people think, oh, wow, that was such a risky decision. But for me, it seemed really relatively low risk.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense you say, well, what's the worst that could happen? You get another degree, you learn some things, you live someplace else. And then, knowing that door is open, you've already passed the background checks and then some.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So, you shared one example, kind of an unfortunate leadership story, but, clearly that you had, I'm sure, great leaders you worked under, things that you learned. The Rupal's book, again, is From CIA to CEO. So I'd love to kind of draw out
Sure.
some of the lessons learned that apply in the business world. Like what's a specific example of, CIA methods that might apply
Yeah.
to business and strategy?
Yeah. So I talk about pretty much all of as many of them as I possibly could in the book. And one of my favorites is sort of that analytical mindset. So at the CIA, one of the things we do is you create these targeting profiles, right? There's a bad person somewhere in the world that is probably trying to do harm to the U.S. and you come up with a profile, right? Of what makes them tick, who are their known associates, what are their habits, what are their hobbies, like the full profile of this human being that you can then hopefully find ways to exploit and then potentially convert into an asset, right? And so that idea of targeting is so incredibly valuable from that perspective. But also what I sort of realized when I left the agency is that, especially when it comes to talking about leadership or even just how we show up in the world, whatever our context, is that analysis and that sort of targeting exercise of really, really understanding what makes a person tick is incredibly valuable when we turn it inwards. And I think perhaps most important for leaders, because, if you don't appreciate what's happening in your inner world, you're probably not going to be a particularly coherent and highly functioning leader of others. And so that idea of targeting yourself or turning that sort of analysis inwards was something that I realized was so powerful, because when I did leave the agency and I was starting my own companies, I was creating all of the rules for myself from scratch, right? I had never worked in an organization that I had started myself before. So I was having to figure it all out. And there were so many frustrations, so many things that I was like, oh, I wish I had like someone to show me the way, and actually turning inwards first and trying to uncover my strengths, uncovering sort of where my time would be better leveraged versus trying to do everything all the time. All of that self-analysis was incredibly, incredibly valuable. And it is a lot of the same work that I do with the leaders I work with now, is first getting them to be very crystal clear on what is their unique makeup. And then also, how does that extend into the unique makeup of their team and then their organization? And it's a really powerful exercise, but very few of us take the time to do it. And so that's why I spend about the first third of the book talking about all of these various self-reflective and self-analytical exercises, because that's the foundation of everything.
Yeah. And, kind of building on, thinking about strategic planning, and I think I can speak from an entrepreneurship standpoint. I think leaders often tend to want, they crave certainty.
Yeah.
Tell me what's going to happen. None of us have a crystal ball. I think in startups, like the idea of the 5-year business plan gets kind of scoffed at, because like who knows? Like, if I see a proposal that shows like this magic exponential growth, I'm like, well, okay, it's easy to draw that line, but how? I mean, that could happen. How do you balance, or maybe what you've learned in your work across all fields, like balancing the need for we need to do some planning, but realizing that we're still moving forward into very unpredictable real world situations?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I think it's matching of strategy and agility. So actually, yeah, you're right. 5-year plans are probably not worth the paper they're written on. And yet you still need to have that North Star of like, well, but this is the big picture, right? This is where we're traveling towards. This is where we want to ideally go. And then of course you can break it down into 1-year plans, quarterly plans, et cetera. But then once the rubber hits the road, right, and you put that strategy into motion, that's when the agility needs to come into play and say, okay, well, this is what we're building towards and what we're working towards. Hey, this is what our customer feedback has been. So maybe we need to pivot in a slight direction, or actually the market doesn't seem it can absorb this, so maybe we need to rethink our product line, or whatever it looks like. And so you need both. You need that flexibility within a structure, and so the structure comes from the plan, but then the flexibility is, of course, in how you operationalize that plan. And that is true in every context, right? Because there is a very, very, very narrow range of things that we can actively control. And there is an infinite number of factors and variables that affect our businesses that we cannot. And so it's being humble in the face of that reality, not trying to force it to be otherwise because you can't. And then again, developing the agility and the situational awareness to know when you stay on course or when you need to pivot and try something different.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great thing to distinguish what we can know, what we can control versus what we have to be prepared to not know. I'm picturing spy movies or Netflix documentary series I had watched last year on spy ops. So it seemed like if there's some sort of mission or raid, it's just the immense planning that goes into like building the model, building a full scale model of the building, or like practicing and knowing what every turn and every corner of that building is, hopefully with high accuracy of, kind of, it seems like reducing down the number of unknowns to the things that are purely unknowable, and probably having plans, or what happens, how do we react to this? How do we react to that?
And also it's about training those instincts, because in addition to the training you might do for that specific context or that specific mission, it's all of the other training that you do that is a little bit more broad-based, right? Like the weapons training, the physical, the self-defense training, all of the other stuff that you go, the mental training, all of that builds a toolkit that then once you start practicing it in different contexts, in real life, in simulations, et cetera, you're building up a body of instinct and also a body that will of experiences that will then help you be a bit more agile in real time when you need to be. So when things inevitably don't follow the exact plan as you've mapped it out, you've got this huge store that you can draw from. And I think that, again, I use the word agility a lot because, well, partly it's become such a buzzword, but secondly, because there are ways to operationalize it, right? And I think so much of it is, from my perspective, and a lot of the training I do with large organizations is like, agility is a muscle that can be trained. It's not something that you either have built into the organization or you don't, right? This is something that can build over time, and but it's behaviors, it's experiences, it's training, it's all of that kind of stuff. And there are very tangible ways that you can do that, so that almost no matter what happens, you can find a way forward, because you have no other choice but to find a way forward. It's only how limited your options are going to be based on, what you've done to prepare for that.
Yeah. And there's a phrase you use, I think it's really interesting, tactical ignorance. Can you tell us about that and the role in decision-making or planning?
This is one of my favorites. And it's basically, the idea is to use ignorance as a tactic, not as a way of being, not as just a general, a state of mind, but ignorance can be a really powerful tool, and it can be a very powerful, tangible tool. So for example, especially for entrepreneurs or people who are on the very sort of boundaries or the frontiers of things that have never been done before, there are, as we just said, an infinite number of things that can go wrong, an infinite number of things that are impossible or seem, too difficult, or no one's ever done it, right? But if you are doing something new, of course no one's done it before, right? And so you have to tactically ignore all of the noise around you that's only focusing on the hurdles and the obstacles, right? Yes, you need to be aware of them, not ignorant of them, but tactically ignore the inputs that are not helpful. Yes, fine. It's going to be really difficult, for example, to build a base on the moon. But instead of obsessing over all of the things that are going to make it really difficult, like we can't ship concrete from Earth to the moon, we can tactically ignore that noise. So then we can focus the practical conversation on what is possible with the constraints we're given on the moon, which is exactly what NASA did, for example, right? They found there's frozen water on the south side of the moon. They're going to use like moon dust and whatever else to build bases with the stuff they have on the moon, as opposed to wishing away all of the variables that they can't control. So it's a practical tool. And it's also a mindset tool around, hey, I'm going to tactically ignore some of the atmospherics around this big important meeting that I'm about to go into, or the people who are going to be in the room or sitting around the table, because I can't do anything about that stuff. What I can do is focus on how I'm going to prepare, on how confident I feel going into that meeting, all of the sort of the internal and external preparation that goes into it. And this is an equally powerful mindset tool, because what I have found, again, especially when it comes to leadership and being bold and creating sort of and realizing bold ambitions, is that pretty much everything technical can be overcome, right? But what separates high performers from everyone else is mastering that head game of success, of high performance, the performance psychology, and tactical ignorance is a great way of doing that. And so, for example, when I was at the CIA, and I was sent into, or I volunteered to go to a war zone and brief the commanding general of the U.S. and international forces. I could have spun myself up and be like, oh, he's a general, and oh, these people around him are so important, and this is that person, and look at the rank and all of the flags and the medals or whatever, right? But I intentionally told myself before going into that first briefing that I was not going to pay attention to all of it. I wasn't going to learn anything about the individuals in the room specifically. I knew their names and their titles, right, but I wasn't going to obsess over how decorated they were and how senior, because that was stuff that was just going to psych me out and I could do nothing to control. What I could control was preparing for the briefing, making sure I tried to do as much research about them so I understood what was important to them and come prepared to address those questions, and ignore all of the atmospherics and the hierarchy and all of that other stuff. So that's why I think tactical ignorance, like I said, is using ignorance as a tactic to help unleash performance, to achieve things that others would have previously dismissed as impossible. Because I think it was Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu who said it, right? Everything is impossible until somebody does it. So you don't have time to waste on all of the impossible stuff. It's like, let's figure out how we're going to make this thing happen.
So, thinking about unpredictability of certain things or obstacles, like what advice do you have for entrepreneurs or leaders who face setbacks? Things are probably not always going to go our way, whether that's due to a mistake or due to external factors that we didn't anticipate. Maybe on some level that's a bit of a mistake. But what are your thoughts about kind of facing or even bouncing back from setbacks or mistakes?
I keep it, well, there's a couple of things. One, that's just part of the process, right? You signed up for this. The day you decided to do something non-traditional or whatever, actually, even in more traditional contexts, setbacks and obstacles are just part of life. Like, you're not uniquely cursed. There's no one gunning just for you. I mean, sometimes there is, but more often than not, it's just, that's the human condition, right? Is setbacks and challenges and obstacles. And then the other thing is, for me, I keep it really simple. When there is a hurdle or a challenge or a setback, no matter how big, I remind myself, and this is true for everyone, you have literally two choices. You either quit or you keep going. It really is that binary, right? So you can choose that. There is no shame in throwing in the towel. There is no shame in saying, you know what, actually, this isn't for me. I don't want the stress of it or the burden or whatever it is. So you can make that choice. And sometimes I think it'd probably be better for humanity if people sort of quit on certain things, instead of just running with them forever. But if you're not going to quit, and you've made that choice that, okay, I'm not going to quit, I'm going to stick with it, then the only choice you have in that context is to then figure out what can you do about it, right? So it's, again, controlling the controllables, focusing on even the tiniest next step. I don't know, calling a friend or, venting to a mentor or asking for advice. Like, I think sometimes we overcomplicate it, and there's all of this, like, chest beating glory of like, oh, I did it all myself. Nobody's done anything themselves. Literally not a single human being of any accomplishment has done anything by themselves. So who can you ask for help? Who are the team? Maybe this is, an opportunity for you to ask some of the tough questions. Who are the people you've got around you? And do you need to swap them out, right? Do you need to make some personnel changes? Do you need to make some just social network changes? Like, whatever it is that is specific to this problem, there is a way forward. So your job then, as the boss, as the founder, as whoever you are, is to find the way forward, but don't do it alone. So ask for help and then just start small.
So again, our guest today, Rupal Patel, her book is From CIA to CEO, Unconventional Life Lessons for Thinking Bigger, Leading Better, and Being Bolder. As an author, I always like to ask authors, like, tell me the story behind the book, decision to start that. A book is kind of like a startup. It's, it's a big project. We don't do it alone. Tell us about even kind of like the process of bringing the book to be.
Yeah, so the book was in my mind. So I've always written. I've always been a writer. I've always loved to write, both fiction and nonfiction. And I've written my entire life. I mean, pretty much since I was a child. And so publishing a book was, traditionally publishing a book was always a big sort of life aspiration for myself. But I never knew what the hows or the whats or the whens of it. And then this book in particular, it's sort of been in my mind. The ideas had been percolating. A lot of the insights and the aha moments I was having, I was sharing in a smaller context through, a newsletter that I was writing. And then I want to say it was around 2019, I think the pain of not writing the book was greater than the pain of forcing myself to sit down and write it. And so what I did is actually exactly what I just shared with your audience is I asked for help. I was like, I've got this bursting like head full of ideas. What I needed help was just some external, objective person to be like, this is how you tame that beast. And so I worked with a book coach for 6 months, and she really helped me just structure my thoughts. She didn't do any of the writing. She didn't do any of the do this and then do this, but she helped me structure my thoughts. And then once I nailed that structure, which was effectively just coming up with the table of contents and sort of the reader journey and all that kind of stuff, it took me about 8 weeks to write the book because I had been thinking about it for so long that when I had just the outline, it was really, really easy. It was pleasurable for me to fill it in. It wasn't easy. It took effort and a lot of thought, of course, but it was fun, even when it was challenging. And it was, I was sort of like, how do I sort of square this circle? Like it was a really enjoyable mental exercise. And but that was for me what the process looked like.
Yeah. And then there's probably an added dimension that most of us don't have to worry about of realizing, okay, I'm putting the letter CIA in the title and the cover. You probably have, I mean, a good sense of what you can and cannot share, or do you have to run any of that past anyone?
Always. So we're all agency officers have a lifelong obligation that if anytime you are referring to your time at the CIA or anything that is, through your experiences there, it has to be cleared through our review board. And the good thing is that I have had nothing but good experiences with the review board. They were wonderful to work with. I was told by another intelligence officer, like, just seed some things in there so that it gives them something to take out, things that that they won't want you to put in there. I didn't do that actually because I just didn't have. I was like, I'm not going to waste my headspace on finding things for them to just take out. I wrote it as I wanted it to be published, and then they were very good about they knew the deadlines that I was working towards, so they always got back to me in plenty of time. They made five like tiny redactions, and that was it. I was like, this changes literally nothing. So of course, and it is a conversation. Obviously, if it's classified stuff, that's not a conversation that you just have to take out. But some things that are on the margins, they're very reasonable. So again, knock on wood, I had nothing but smooth experiences working with them.
Yeah, well, good. And I love the way you articulated there that tension of the pain of not writing it outweighing.
Yeah.
I always thought, the difference between, there's a difference between saying I want to write a book or I'm going to write a book. Like that might get someone started, but there's something closer to this feeling of I have to write this.
Yes.
That leads to the book actually getting done.
Yeah, because it's so easy to not do these things, right? And the same is true for entrepreneurs, right? You've got this idea and it's so easy to just be like, I don't have the time. It's going to, and again, for me, maybe this resonates with some of your listeners. Like I am the type of person who it is almost like it needs to be painful before it really sparks me to do something. And not on everything, of course, right? But things that are going to take this level of commitment and uncertainty and all of that stuff. It was the pain that was the motivator.
Then last thing I wanted to ask you, and I'll link to this in the show notes, the TED Talk that you did. I enjoyed, I watched the video of that, and I hope others will too, on what you call, the power of owning your weird as a way to kind of unleash excellence. If you could kind of give us a summary or that what it means to you owning your weird.
So one of the beautiful things about the work that I do, whether it's, sort of working with large organizations or writing this book, I meet tens of thousands of people, total strangers, every single year. And it's all over the world, all age demographics, professional demographics. I mean, it's a pretty good, uh, sort of a huge range. And one of the things that I found comes up without fail is this two really interesting things, actually. One is that when I talk about some of my experiences, like what I've shared in the TED Talk, so many people come up to me afterwards and said they feel seen, that they, even if they seem superficially as, sort of someone from the majority or someone who has all their stuff together or like an elite or whatever, has gone through a very similar process of feeling like an outlier, feeling a bit like an outsider. And what I've started to realize, because I still even now do some one-on-one work with very senior executives, even at the C-suite level, there are people who feel like they can't be who they are. Like they can't, talk about their hobbies because people won't take them as seriously, or can't admit that they play in a rock band because their clients will somehow think less of them. And it's so sad to me that we've come to a place where pretty much every human being is going through an experience of feeling in some way they don't fit. Not every single one, but many, many people. And we're all having to hide it. And
Mhm.
it's this weird thing of like, but who decided that was the rule, right? Like who wrote the rule that lawyers can't be in rock bands? Who wrote the rules about like what is the appropriate uniform to wear as an accountant or as a teacher, or like, so many of these things that we just take for granted. And then those of us who don't fit that mold feel like, oh my gosh, well, I could never be an accountant or a lawyer or a teacher or a leader or a CEO, right? And so for me, it was about challenging those narratives in a empowering way so that people can accept and see that, one, pretty much all of us are going through this at some point, even at the highest levels. And two, if everyone is weird, then nobody is weird. So then just be who you are, right? It doesn't have to be an in-your-face endeavor. You don't have to be shouting about like, look at me and look at all the things I am. You can just be who you are. And I think it's such a simple message, but so many people, from, I kid you not, from like school children to like 80-year-old retirees, have come up to me crying about how like they needed to hear that. And so I didn't know it would have such resonance when I sort of, wrote my talk, but I had a hunch that it would, because again, the things I talk about in the book, the things I talk about generally, even if they're in a business context, they're pretty universal human condition things. And so the inspiration was to be really honest about my journey, right? Of like, I grew up as feeling like this outsider, being made to feel like an outsider person, and realizing that some of that, in hindsight, yes, was people making me feel that way, but some of it I was projecting, because that's like where I was mentally, right? Like all of the times that I was made to feel like a weirdo was sometimes of my own doing. And I think sometimes, we can do it to ourselves even when nobody else is doing it to us. So yeah, it was to be really honest about that. No matter who you are, everyone's going through some stuff. And so let's just acknowledge that. Let's be a little bit more, give people the benefit of the doubt when we're meeting strangers or having interactions with people that are kind of annoying. And also let's start being okay with the fact that the world is full of different people with different backgrounds and different interests and different ways of dressing and whatever else it looks like. And that's a really good thing, right? We want that. That's a wonderful thing. So yeah, I talk about owning your weird as a power, because it can be a real power. Nobody else is you. Nobody else has your insights, your experiences, your views on the world. Nobody ever has before, and nobody ever will again. So don't throw that away.
It's very well said, Rupal. So thank you for that. I hope people go check out the talk and the book. Again, our guest today, Rupal Patel. Her book is titled From CIA to CEO: Unconventional Life Lessons for Thinking Bigger, Leading Better, and Being Bolder. This has been really, really great. Thank you for being here on the podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Mark. Thank you for having me.